Greetings, friends of liberty. Now, if we were to cast our gaze around the continent, thinking to understand why particular nation-states thrived and others faltered, surely amongst those faltering candidates at present our eyes would come to rest on that nation Marguerite and I can see in a good day from the cliffs of Dover. Yes, a nation that, having recognized in themselves their many weaknesses and frailties, seem to be bringing forth a societal transformation so thorough as to convulse the entire populace in a never-ending tumult, both revolutionary and reactionary. Shall we now delineate the multiplicitous characteristics of the French state that have led to this violent upheaval? Trait number 1. Their succession of absolute monarchs from Louis the Stammerer to Charles the Fat and the Mad, and exemplified most notoriously and illustratively, of course, by that vainest of autocrats, the Sunflower King. During his lengthy reign of iniquity, the harms he brought to the French people were legion. His never-ending wars of devolution, the Franco-Dutch, of the reunions, 9 years, and of the Spanish succession, all attempts to expand his dominion over other nations and peoples. B, by the primitive yoke of taxation borne by his subjects to finance them. C, his needless persecution of Protestants. And D, his attempts to make so many decisions himself instead of delegating these tasks to more competent ministers. Trait number 2 of the French nation, their lack of parliamentary representation. In England, of course, we have established now for over a century the clear political supremacy of Parliament, but in the old Gallic kingdom, they didn't even call their Parliament, named, of course, l'État généraux, from 1614 to 1789, at which point 'twas too late. How can a people achieve a just taxation without any representation for close to 2 centuries? Is it not any wonder that the French, in their displeasure, finally stormed the Bastille and started removing noble heads right and left? I would be sore tempted myself to avail myself of such measures. Trait number 3. The sometimes excessive and, more importantly, regressive levels of taxation for over a century, inaugurated again by Louis XIV. These taxes financed his wars, the cost of holding the sumptuous court at Versailles in residence, and his growing bureaucracy. Indeed, my very own sources in France, again and again, have confirmed that in the last decade, those regions that have paid the most salt tax have been the most likely to rebel against Louis XVI. 'Tis a hated tax indeed that can transform royalists into republicans. Finally, trait number 4 of the French nation, their tolerance of the exceedingly venal institution of the Gallic Catholic Church, who, with its privileges, almost complete tax exemptions, tithes, and other revenues, achieved a yearly income in pre-revolutionary France of 25% of the French state itself. What an astonishing, exploitive institution! 'Tis no wonder the French populace have taken to drowning priests en masse after mass. Now, if we move from the sad state of affairs and to the issue of the general principles of why nations fail in your own 21st century and throughout the entirety of all recorded history, we find today the groundbreaking research of Nobel Prize winner Daron Acemoglu with James Robinson. They focusing specifically on this very question, why nations fail. For the authors, the answer is undeniably clear. The more extractive as opposed to inclusive
institutions a country embodies, the more likely it is to fail. They begin with an illustrative example. The city of Nogales is cut in half by a fence. If you stand by it and look north, you'll see Nogales, Arizona, located in Santa Cruz County. Most teenagers are in school, and the population is relatively healthy with high life expectancy. Life south of the fence is different. The income of the average household there is about one-third that in Nogales, Arizona. Mothers have to worry about high rates of infant mortality, roads are in bad condition, crime is high, and opening a business is a risky activity. And what do the authors believe ultimately explains the vastly different level of civilization in the northern and southern part of Nogales? Their vastly different histories. In Latin America, after the conquests of Cortes in Mexico and Pizarro in Peru, the conquistadors and their subordinates then either enslaved or turned into serfs much of the native population. At, for example, the famous silver mines of Potosi, both indigenous Indians and imported Africans were enslaved. But what were conditions like in British North America? In the end, quite different. Initially, the colonists at Jamestown had the same bad idea as the Spaniards to capture a native chief and make him force his tribesmen to work for them. Instead, they found this unworkable since the population density of North America was hundreds of times less than that of Spanish America. In addition, they also had the bad idea of setting up the colony communistically, with no one owning their own plots of farmland. However, with the arrival of Captain James Smith, who soon introduced private property to the colony, 50 acres per settler, the colony began to flourish and, once it had started to grow tobacco for export, took off. As time progressed, that initial configuration of British more rights-respecting institutions and Latin American more rights-violating continued. So, for example, in 1910, the year in which the Mexican Revolution started, there were only 42 banks in Mexico, and 2 of these controlled 60% of total banking assets. Unlike in the United States, there was practically no competition among Mexican banks. But in the United States, the politicians who attempted to create these banking monopolies, unlike their Mexican counterparts, were subject to dismissal through the ballot box. Even today, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs represent the American way of making money by creating a revolutionary new product, while the richest Mexican tycoon, Carlos Slim, with his huge conglomeration of monopoly industries and special favors granted by the Mexican governments, represents the Mexican way. Throughout Latin America, a relative inability to create democratic and constitutional regimes persisted, with those on the frustrated left then responding to a lack of democracy with the Mexican Revolution in 1910, the Bolivian in 1952, Cuban in 1959, and Nicaraguan in 1979. And from the right, Chile suffered under Pinochet from 73 to 90, Guatemala under the dictator General Montt from 62 to 96, and even Argentina, usually democratic, under a series of dictators from 76 to 93. Having contrasted the institutional and property rights differences between the Anglosphere and Hispanosphere, the authors now turn their attention to biologist and author Jared Diamond and his geographical explanations. As early as the 18th century, French philosopher Montesquieu had argued that people are more vigorous in cold climates. This superiority must produce a great many effects, for instance, a greater boldness and more courage. Diamond holds a much more modern and sophisticated view of the effects of geography and climate, having shown in his Pulitzer Prize-winning Guns, Germs, and Steel that, for example, there are many more species of animals across the Eurasian continent, like goats, pigs, horses, cows, and sheep, and plants like wheat, barley, and rice that were beneficial to human beings than existed on other continents like Africa or the Americas. These extra species made it very attractive for societies to make the transition from a hunter-gatherer to a farming lifestyle, and so accelerated their civilizational advancement. But the problem with Diamond's emphasis on geographical causation is that the more civilization advances, the more pure knowledge, not geography, drives those advances forward, because distance and location become more and more irrelevant. In addition, in order to incentivize the discovery and implementation of pure knowledge, societies must protect property rights. Those that don't, no matter what initial geographical advantage, will not prosper. Having argued for the modern irrelevance of diamond, they then turn to criticize cultural theories of why nations fail. These typically historically exemplified by sociologist Max Weber in his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. In that, Weber argued that Protestants by nature were simply better capitalists than Catholics. In more recent times, cultural theory has been applied to Africans who remain mired in poverty allegedly because they lack a good work ethic, still believe in witchcraft and magic, or resist new Western technologies. So how instead would our authors explain African backwardness? By again focusing on institutional factors. Number one, the slave trade made the states of many African countries more absolutist and organized to enslave and sell others to European slavers. Secondly, warring and enslaving ultimately destroyed whatever order and legitimate state authority existed in sub-Saharan Africa. Thus, slavery transformed African society in every respect. Number two, in addition, during this period, the practice of states waging war to gain slaves meant either a state got really powerful or it damaged many of the other neighboring states, reducing them to lawless regions, massively depopulated, partly because of the people sold into slavery, partly because of no parents to raise children, and partly because of all the people killed in the constant wars. Number three, even after the slave trade and the export of slaves from Africa ended, slavery now continued within Africa, and slavery, rather than contracting, appeared to have expanded in Africa throughout the 19th century. In the West African kingdoms of Asante and Dahomey, well over half of the population were slaves. And for Western Sudan, a large swath of Western Africa stretching from Senegal, Mali, and Burkina Faso to Niger and Chad, 30% of the population was still enslaved in 1900. So given the powerful effects of slavery, it's not surprising that Africa remained backward for so long. This is why they dismiss cultural explanations. Now, given that the essential weakness of slavery is that, while you can force people to do things, like cut sugarcane or hoe a field, you can't force them to think. And so the essential weakness of slavery is its intrinsic inability towards discovering and implementing knowledge. Free societies, in contrast, incentivizing the discovery of new knowledge through innovation and new technologies, protect the intellectual property rights of inventors with patents. Patents historically were systematized in the Statute of Monopolies legislated by the English Parliament in 1623. And after the increased legal rights protections attendant to the Glorious Revolution in 1688, came many brilliant inventors and inventions. James Watt, for example, inventor of the first steam engine with a separate condenser, in 1775 wrote to his father, "Dear father, after a series of various and violent oppositions, I have at last got an act of Parliament vesting the property of my new fire engines in me, which I hope will be very beneficial to me as there is already considerable demand for them." Watt's ability to receive a patent for his invention stood in stark contrast to that of English inventor William Lee, who almost 2 centuries earlier, in 1589, had actually invented a workable knitting machine, which promised vast increases in speed for knitting stockings. But when he went to Elizabeth I and later James I to receive a patent, he was refused both times, both sovereigns fearing that his machine would create political instability and economic turmoil amongst their subjects. The authors argue very broadly that the reaction to Lee's brilliant invention illustrates that the fear of creative destruction is the main reason why there was no sustained increase in living standards between the Neolithic and Industrial revolutions. And how did other countries compare during this time? Why didn't the Industrial Revolution happen in their countries? Was it because they were simply less protective of property rights and less supportive of inclusive institutions than we English? Yes. In Spain, for example, its decline after 1600 is caused partly by the crown's heavy regulation of trade, the privileges of traffic being given to guilds of favored merchants. And even trade within the Americas was heavily regulated, and a merchant located in New Spain, which roughly corresponded to modern Mexico, could not trade directly with anyone in New Granada, modern Colombia, without royal assent. In addition, the Spanish Parliament, the Cortes, was much less representative than the English, not constituting as broad a set of groups as the English Parliament did. Other countries that also embodied these same Spanish principles were, number one, the Habsburg dominions of Austria-Hungary, stifling economic development, for example, by only grudgingly giving out railroad and coal concessions throughout the entire 19th century. Two, Russia, having, aside from Boris Yeltsin, an almost unbroken string of autocrats, ranging from the Romanovs like Nicholas II, communists like Stalin, or fascist kleptocrats like Putin. Typically coercive here during the Soviet Union was a law that made absenteeism, defined as any 20 minutes unauthorized absence, or even idling on the job, a criminal offense that could be punished by 6 months hard labor and a 25% cut in pay. Between 1940 and 1955, 36 million people, about one-third of the adult population, were found guilty of such offenses. Of these, 15 million were sent to prison and 250,000 were shot. Yes, the joys of being forced to work for Mother Russia. Number three, another highly regulative country with top-down control was China, whose emperor, for example, in 1661, ordered that all people living along the entire southern coast, once the most commercially active part of China, should all move 17 miles inland, thus destroying much Chinese trade and commerce. Of course, the French Revolution comprised one of the great historical instances of destroying extractive and rights-violating institutions. As the authors argue, in one swoop it abolished the feudal system and all the obligations and dues that it entailed, and entirely removed the tax exemptions of the nobility and the clergy. And once the French armies started conquering European countries, they initiated a radical process of reform in the lands they'd conquered, abolishing the remaining vestiges of serfdom and feudal land relations and imposing equality before the law. The clergy were stripped of their special status and power, and the guilds in urban areas were stamped out. Of course, the British experience, despite various alarums and excursions like the Petersburg Massacre and sundry riots, was that of slowly and peacefully reforming corrupt practices and expanding the franchise. Violence was rarely exhibited since the English people trusted that constructive change would come. So what are the conclusions of the authors, having regaled us with many illustrative and constructive examples which demonstrate the importance of protecting property rights throughout history? They are, number one, rich nations are rich largely because they managed to develop inclusive institutions at some point during the past 300 years. True. Number two, when extractive institutions create huge inequalities in society and great wealth and unchecked power for those in control, there will be many wishing to fight to take control of the state and institutions. True. Number three, inclusive economic institutions are in turn supported by and support inclusive political institutions and are able to achieve some amount of political centralization so as to establish law and order, the foundations of secure property rights, and an inclusive market economy. True. Finally, number four, with extractive institutions like slavery, growth will not be sustained for two key reasons. First, sustained economic growth requires innovation, and innovation destabilizes established power relations in politics. Secondly, the ability of those who dominate extractive institutions to benefit greatly implies that political power under extractive institutions is highly coveted, making many groups and individuals fight to obtain it, creating political and economic instability. So in a nutshell, to summarize and bring us back to where we started, Peru is so much poorer than Western Europe and the United States today because of its institutions. And to understand the reasons for this, we need to understand the historical process of institutional development in Peru. And so there you have it. That's their theory of why nations fail. Now we might ask, did they make any mistakes? A few, but not many. This is a great book. I would give it an A because they demonstrate perfectly how important protecting property rights is in driving civilizational progress constantly forward. Let me briefly outline their few mistakes. Number 1, they ask what can be done to kickstart or perhaps just facilitate the process of the development of inclusive political institutions. The honest answer, of course, is that there is no recipe for building such institutions. This is false. An instance of kickstarting would be precisely to spread the knowledge that they've given in this book around society. But spreading it is made much harder because of the fact that so many Western institutions today are funded and controlled by the state, whose employees don't want to spread it. One specific example is public institutions of education, both elementary and higher. You think Randy Weingarten and the American Teachers Union want to spread knowledge of the superiority of the free market in all their classrooms? No. So until education in the West is more privatized, spreading these and similar ideas found in this book will be an uphill battle. Number 2, and so do the authors themselves understand this, that the contemporary monopoly of public lower and higher education is part of the problem, and that these are actually extractive institutions too? A very example of their thesis? No. They say instead at one point, talking about the educational history of England, the education system was made more accessible to the masses. The Education Act of 1870 committed the government to the systematic provision of universal education for the first time. Education became free of charge in 1891. As a result, the proportion of 10-year-olds enrolled in school, which stood at 40% in 1870, increased to 100% in 1900. False. Not as a result. First, as anyone who's had experience with either American or English public education knows, the fact that the public schools force everyone into them does not mean that the children there are educated or learn something very well. To the contrary, study after study shows that the public schools in many U.S. cities and many British horribly fails. One book which I reviewed, James Bartholomew's The Welfare State We're In, described this exactly. So public school attendance does not equate with getting a good education. Secondly, the graph of actual literacy in England during the whole of the 19th century shows a constant, steady increase of literacy, completely unaffected by and unconnected to all the educational acts the authors commend. Number 3, the authors want to use the terms inclusive and exclusive to describe everything important. So, for example, they call Mao's Great Leap Forward extractive. And it's true, it was, but it gets more to the point to call the Great Leap Forward that killed 20 to 40 million Chinese simply central planning of the economy, which always fails not because it is extractive per se, but instead rights violating. In addition, in fascist regimes like Nazi Germany, the whole point was to extract everything to satisfy Hitler and his goals. But at least in some communistic regimes, the point was to establish communism, not to extract things from the population for the benefit of Stalin, Lenin, Mao, or Gorbachev. 4, finally, their take on Catholicism specifically, and religion and cultural theories in general. What they don't recognize is that religions can also be utterly extractive institutions in getting state funding, as the Catholic Church did in France until the Revolution, and as Islam has done throughout its entire lifespan. This means that when religions become extractive or rights violating, getting their funding from the state, then they, and their ideology, becomes just as destructive as all the other institutions the authors describe when they are extractive. Thus, given that Protestantism historically has been less extractive, it's not surprising that in chemistry, physics, medicine, and economics, Protestants during the 20th century have won 3.5 times as many Nobels as Catholics per capita. And even less surprising that Jews during that time span with few extractive historical institutions are off the charts, beating everyone by collecting 25% of all Nobels in the aforementioned sciences. So what they misunderstand when they dismiss cultural theories of failure and success is that extractive institutions can themselves create culture. Very happy for my part that the big, beautiful channel, that magnificent arm of the Atlantic, so deftly separates England from France. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.